What would Nietzsche have to say about what we've shared so far about these metaphysical terms, since you said you were into him?
Yeah, so Nietzsche thinks of, well, you read a different book of Nietzsche, you read, he says something else, but just taking some statements he makes, he speaks of being, for instance, as the last trailing cloud of evaporating reality, right? So it's nothing, right? What is being, right? You've got this cup here, you've got its different aspects. That's it. Where's the being?
That's what I was saying earlier with the accidents.
Yeah,
and that's all you got.
Yeah. So being for Nietzsche just is kind of an empty concept, right? And he would say about the causes. There's a side of Nietzsche where he, somewhat like Kant, wants to say that how we see the world is a projection, mm-hmm. right? Or it's not the world itself, it's just our interpretation or what we've projected. You take that away and there's no world. So he would say, at best, the different features of this cup that I've just talked about in terms of the four causes are a projection of my mind. It's not something that's really out there, right? And being, well, that's just an empty concept. Yeah.
It's such a fascinating discussion as to how we got to Kant, trying to save science from Hume, presumably, going back to Descartes, and how you get that toothpaste back in the tube. Like once you start looking at reality and saying, this doesn't actually exist the way we think it does, how do you even argue against it at that point? How do you bring people back to that kind of more innocent and pure way of looking at reality, the way Plato did?
Right. Well, one way is to see how this projection idea that you get in Kant, well, you already see it starting in Hume, as you mentioned, and then it's more systematized in Kant, and then you find it again in Nietzsche, and so on. One way to do it is to show how that this approach to reality, which we could call constructivist or projectionist, is self-refuting, right? Because there has to be at least one thing that isn't projected, and that's the one doing the projecting, right? The
presumably, unless Hume's right.
But you can't you can't have a projector doing the projecting if it doesn't exist in the first place, right? You don't. My consciousness doesn't bring it into existence. My consciousness is something that's already there, given, right? Apart from anything that I do.
Wasn't this kind of how phenomenology got off the ground, with Husserl going back to the things themselves? Was this kind of being fed up with looking at,
Right. Well, I think that Husserl saw that, the problems with modern philosophy. He had an appreciation for Hume and Kant, but he thought that you could take their approach to a certain extent, but actually get to reality.
Yeah.
Right. And you did that for Husserl by bracketing off your presuppositions and just paying attention to things as they give themselves.
Yeah,
right?
Imagine.
Yeah.
What a novel concept. Sorry, it's very belittling. Obviously, he's brilliant, but it just sounds so obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Do you know when I was a teenager, I was a solipsist without knowing what that was? I had a bout of solipsism for about, I don't know, maybe a month. I got really afraid that no one else existed. Yeah.
So what happened?
Have I talked about this too much, Neil? This is what's tough when you have a show. You only have so many anecdotes to share. I remember standing in my bedroom and having the door closed and wondering, how do I know, sort of epistemologically, not that I knew that word then either, if I was to swing the door open, maybe I could catch it in its non-existence, But I'd throw it open and of course it would be there, And I said to my best friend, one of my best friends, Gareth, in the library, that I was afraid he didn't exist. And he tried to convince me that he did. He was concerned for me. And I just thought, well, that's what you would bloody say.
Did he slap you? Did he punch you?
He should have. Okay. Who did the slapping? My projection. But it's a scary rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
I actually, you familiar with the philosopher William Lane Craig?
Yeah, sure.
He talks about, well, actually it was Plantinga who I think first, well, many people have spoken about this, but the idea of God being a properly basic belief that isn't based upon other beliefs that I have, but it's just part of my immediate experience.
Yeah.
And I've often thought that sort of obsessing over arguments for God's existence could have the same negative effect of obsessing over arguments against solipsism might. If it's true that God's existence can be properly basically held, like my existence can, I'm sure there's YouTube videos out there that are talking about how it's quite possible that no one else exists. And you could go down to a rabbit hole, and that would ruin your relationships with your wife, with your kids, with your friends.
No, of course,
And that's not to say we don't have good arguments for God's existence, or we shouldn't be concerned with them in the efforts of evangelization and so forth. But just to say that you can see how it could interfere with your relationship with God.
No, that's definitely true. There's a place for the arguments, and they're even if they're sound, they may not be convincing to a particular person. Not necessarily because they don't recognize the arguments as sound, but for certain emotional, reasons, because of the person's history and so on, right? So when to use the arguments is, I think, always a matter of prudence. But we can still say, whether you understand it or not, these arguments are sound, right? Like we could say for arguments in or proofs in any other field, right? So they have a place, and they can have a detrimental effect on some people, but on other people, they can be what finally convinces them, right?
If you like that clip, be sure to like and subscribe. Cheers.